I was in the kitchen when the front door closed behind the rest of the family. It was one of those rare weekends where everyone was out for the day. My parents had gone to visit some relatives, and my stepbrother Alex had stayed behind, claiming he had a lot of schoolwork to finish. It wasn't unusual for me to be alone with Alex, but something about today felt different. There was a certain stillness in the house that made every sound, even the faintest, seem louder than usual. I busied myself with making lunch, trying to ignore the weird feeling in my stomach. Alex had been acting a little distant lately, more than usual. We had never been particularly close, but after our parents got married a few years ago, things always felt tense between us. I had just finished chopping some vegetables when I heard him walking down the stairs. His steps were slow and deliberate, like he was thinking about something. He appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "Hey, Jess," he said casually, but there was an edge to his voice that I couldn't place. "What are you making?" "Just some pasta," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Want some?" "Sure," he said, but instead of walking away like he usually did, he stayed, watching me with a strange expression. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, and it made me nervous. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked, turning to face him. He had that look on his face again, the one I'd noticed over the past few weeks but never dared to question. "Yeah, why?" He smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You seem a little on edge." "I'm fine," I lied, focusing on the task at hand. Suddenly, he walked over to the counter and stood close. Too close. I could smell his cologne, fresh and a little overwhelming in the small space. "You know," he started, his voice low, "it's just the two of us here today." There was a pause and I didn't dare look up at him. No parents, no interruptions. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "Yeah, I know," I said, keeping my voice steady, but I couldn't hide the tension. The air between us grew heavy. I turned off the stove and started to plate the food, but my hands were shaking slightly. I wasn't sure where this was going, and a part of me didn't want to find out. But another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, was curious. Alex reached out and brushed my arm lightly, and even though it was the slightest touch, it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I stiffened. "What's up with you?" I asked, half joking, trying to diffuse whatever this was. But instead of backing off, he leaned in closer. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper now. His words hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and suddenly I realized where this was going. "Alex, don't," I said, my voice trembling slightly. His eyes darkened, and for a split second, I wasn't sure what he was going to do next. "I'm just saying," he continued, a sly smile playing on his lips. "It's just the two of us here. What's the harm in talking?" But it didn't feel like talking was what he had in mind. I stepped back, putting some distance between us. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, and the space between Alex and me seemed suffocating. His words were playful on the surface, but there was something darker underneath, something that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Talking, huh?" I said, trying to regain control of the situation. I forced a laugh, but it came out shaky. "What exactly do you want to talk about, Alex?" His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another step toward me, closing the gap once more. My heart raced, and I could feel the tension thickening. "Come on, Jess," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "You know what I mean." I turned away, grabbing the plates I'd set aside. I could feel his presence behind me, looming like a shadow. I needed to get out of the kitchen, away from the intensity of the moment. "I'm going to take this to the living room," I mumbled, trying to sound casual. I didn't look back as I walked out, but I could hear him following me. As I set the plates down on the coffee table, Alex plopped onto the couch, his eyes never leaving me. It felt like he was waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. I sat on the opposite end of the couch, keeping a safe distance between us. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching it. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. For a while, we sat in silence. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second passing by painfully slow. I could feel the tension simmering between us, unspoken but undeniable. "Do you ever think about what things would be like if we weren't related?" Alex suddenly asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost like he wasn't sure he should be saying it. My stomach dropped. This was crossing a line I wasn't sure either of us knew how to deal with. I didn't answer right away. How was I supposed to answer something like that? It's a weird question, I said, trying to deflect. I picked up the food on my plate, but my appetite was long gone. Is it though? He pressed, leaning forward. I mean, technically we're not even blood related, you're just my stepsister. There it was, the excuse that made this conversation seem like it wasn't completely wrong, but it didn't make it right either. I finally looked at him, and the intensity in his eyes caught me off guard. He wasn't joking. This wasn't just some weird sibling banter. He was serious, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. Alex, we can't, I started, but he interrupted. Why not? He asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. Who's going to know? It's not like we're doing anything wrong. We're just talking. Talking. He kept using that word like it was some kind of cover for what he was really getting at. I shook my head. It doesn't matter, we're family now. Whether you like it or not, I gestured between us. This can't happen. He didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see the frustration building behind his calm facade. Jess, he finally said, leaning closer. I've seen the way you look at me sometimes. Don't act like you've never thought about it. I froze. His words hit harder than I expected because, deep down, I knew there was some truth to them. There had been moments, fleeting thoughts that I always pushed away, that I never allowed myself to dwell on. But now, sitting here with him, it was like those thoughts were out in the open, exposed for both of us to see. Stop, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was telling him to stop or if I was telling myself. He didn't stop, though. Instead, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers lingering a little too long. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated the way my body reacted. I hated that I didn't immediately push him away. Alex, please, I said, my voice trembling now. This isn't right. He pulled his hand back, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. For a moment, I thought he was going to push further, but then he leaned back on the couch, sighing heavily. You're right, he said finally, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. The room felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken tension. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say next. I could feel my pulse slowing down, but my mind was still racing. Part of me was relieved that he backed off, but another part, the one I didn't want to acknowledge, was disappointed. I hated that feeling. We should just forget this ever happened, I said, more to myself than him. Alex didn't respond right away, but after a moment he nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe you're right. But something in his voice told me that neither of us was going to forget this anytime soon. The silence between us stretched on, growing thicker with every passing second. I tried to focus on the TV, but nothing was registering. My mind kept replaying Alex's words, his touch, and the way I had responded to it. I couldn't shake the uncomfortable truth that, in some twisted way, a part of me had wanted to push him further. I hated that thought. It made me feel like I had crossed some unspoken boundary, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. But emotional boundaries can be just as real as physical ones, and it was clear that both of us had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I'm going to clean up the kitchen, I muttered, standing up abruptly. I needed to move, to get away from him, even if just for a few minutes. I heard Alex mumble something in response, but I didn't stick around to hear what it was. My heart was still racing, and the walls of the house felt like they were closing in. In the kitchen, I tried to keep myself busy by washing the dishes, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the couch, to Alex, and to what had just happened. I wasn't sure how we were supposed to move on from this, how we could pretend everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. As I stood there, scrubbing a plate that was already clean, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Alex. Jess, he said softly, standing in the doorway. We should talk. I shook my head, keeping my back to him. I don't think we should, he sighed, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. We can't just pretend this didn't happen. That's exactly what we're going to do, I said firmly, finally turning to face him. I met his eyes, trying to stay strong, but it was hard. I could see the conflict in his expression, and I knew he wasn't going to let go of this easily. Why? He asked, stepping closer. Why are you so afraid to admit there's something between us? Because it's wrong, I snapped louder than I meant to. It's not normal, Alex. We're family. Or at least we're supposed to be family. He scoffed. We're not really family, Jess, you know that. We didn't grow up together. We barely even know each other until a few years ago. It doesn't matter, I shot back, my voice shaking. We live together now. Our parents are married. We're supposed to be siblings. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. I could see the battle going on in his head, the same one I was struggling with. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the consequences of what could happen if we gave in to whatever this was. I get it, he said quietly, his tone softer now. I do. But I can't pretend like I don't feel something for you, Jess. His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Admitting there was something between us was dangerous, not just because of what it could mean for our relationship, but because once it was out in the open, there was no going back. We can't do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It'll ruin everything. Alex took a deep breath and nodded slowly, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I don't want to ruin anything. I didn't expect to feel this way. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't let this go any further. I had to put an end to it before things got even more complicated. We need to stop, I said firmly. Whatever this is, whatever you think it could be, it's not real. We're just confused because we've been stuck in the same house for so long. Once we get some space, things will go back to normal. Alex didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see the internal struggle on his face. Finally, he nodded, though reluctantly. Okay, he said, stepping back slightly. I'll back off. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a deep sense of unease. I had hoped this would make everything easier, but now I wasn't so sure. Thank you, I said quietly. Though my voice was strained, I forced a small smile, but it felt hollow. He turned to leave, but then he paused at the doorway. Jess, for what it's worth, I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know. I guess I misread things. It's okay, I said, though we both knew it wasn't. Let's just forget about it. He gave me one last look before walking away, leaving me alone in the kitchen once again. As soon as he was gone, I leaned against the counter, my head spinning. I had stopped whatever was happening between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There was something unresolved, something that still lingered in the air between us, and no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew that avoiding it wouldn't make it go away. Days passed, and Alex and I settled into a fragile silence. We both avoided talking about what had happened, but the tension between us lingered like a storm waiting to break. Every time our paths crossed in the house, it felt like the air grew heavier, like something unsaid was pressing down on both of us. One evening, I was in my room when there was a soft knock on the door. I knew it was him before he even spoke. Jess, can we talk? His voice was hesitant, careful. I hesitated, but finally I opened the door just a crack. About what? I want things to be okay between us, he said quietly. I don't want things to be weird forever. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Yeah, me too. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. Then without saying anything else, he nodded and turned to leave. As he walked away, I felt a strange sense of finality settle over me. Whatever had been brewing between us was over, and even though there was still tension, it was clear that we both had decided to move on. And in that quiet moment, I realized that sometimes the things we don't say can be louder than the ones we do.